Welcome to our 10-minute daily Mashiach thought number 180. Leilu Nishmas Gutta Bas Peretz and for Shlemu Kavod Tmar Shifra Bas Liba Feda. We have been talking about the themes of the Rebbe Sichos in Tafshin Nun Aleph and Tafshin Nun Beis. And so far what we've seen was that in these themes of living with Mashiach, it was generally the concept, when we talk about living with the times, as the Alter Rebbe explains it, we usually think of that living with the times as living with the people in the parsha of the week. That's usually of how the Daf Leb Mitzvah is actually interpreted. And the idea is that whatever parsha we're reading, we read about, whether it's Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Moshe, and whoever it might be, that we learn from them and how to live right now. So we take lessons from their lives. Now, when we say that we're going to live with the parsha or live with those people, there's actually two ways to understand how we live with them. Okay? What are those two ways? So the first way is the way that this is generally explained and how we usually hear it taught. And that's the idea that we separate the physical story that's in the parsha from the spiritual inner meaning. So if we, for example, learn about something that happened, let's say it's Avram and Sara, and we learn about it's the idea of neshama and the guf, and the relationship between Avram and Sara is the relationship between our souls and our bodies, and then we figure out how does that apply to us in our lives. Or, for example, when we talk about the fact that Hashem appeared to Avram, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov, and we know, for example, that the Avos represent Ava. Avram Avinu stands for love, Avas Hashem, and Yitzchak for Yiras Hashem, for fear of Hashem, and Yaakov represents Rachamim. So when Hashem appears to Avram, that's the idea we could separate, again, the physical story from the spiritual inner meaning, and that is Hashem helping us to arouse within us love of Hashem, fear of Hashem, Rachamim. So we apply the stories that we hear and the personalities in the parsha to our neshama, to us on a spiritual level. So too, we can talk about when we read about Moshe Rabbeinu in the parsha, we say, what does Moshe Rabbeinu represent? That Moshe Rabbeinu represents, for example, bittul, being totally bottled to Hashem. So too, in the week that we read about Moshe Rabbeinu, we say, okay, that's about humility. And this idea about humility, because Moshe Rabbeinu is one who said, what am I? That's kind of idea. So too, we try to find the Moshe Rabbeinu within each of us. In other words, that level of humility that is with each of us. However, in the Rebbe's Torah, we find another way of interpreting living with the time and living with the people of the parsha. And this is very specifically seen more in the Rebbe's Torah than any other one of the Rebbeim. And that is where the Rebbe takes this idea of living with the parsha or living with the times, not just as a story that we separate the physical, literal story from the spiritual, but the Rebbe makes the story itself literal. So when we are learning, for example, about Moshe Rabbeinu, the Rebbe is not saying we'll take the characteristics of Moshe Rabbeinu and apply it to our neshama. When the Rebbe talks about Moshe Rabbeinu, we'll say then that we have to then learn about the Moshe in our generation. So the Rebbe applies it very specifically to us. An example of this is we have the pasuk in the Chumash where we have when it talks about when Bnei Yisrael, when the Bnei Yisrael were ready to leave Har Sinai to continue traveling. What does it say in the pasuk? It was in the 40th year, so not after Matan Torah, but really at the end of their time. It was in the 11th month, which is the month of Shvat, in the first of the month. Moshe Rabbeinu finally spoke to Bnei Yisrael, and he said, Rav lachem sheves bahar hazeh, it's enough that you've been sitting here at this mountain, bo u'shuas aretz kam, it's time to go and inherit the land. Now, when the Rebbe quoted this in the Parsha, the Rebbe then said, not that just learning about what it was then, but the Rebbe said that this applies to the Moshe Rabbeinu, to the neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu that is within our generation. And therefore, he actually applied it in a Sicha of Rosh Chodesh Shvat and Tafshin Nun. The Rebbe said, Rosh Chodesh Shvat, at that time, the Rebbe said, Yimlu Arbaim Shanal Nasi is quite Kedushas Admor Nasi Kinasi Hachi. So what was the Rebbe said? At that point in time, Tafshin Nun, it's been 40 years for the Nasias of the Rebbe as the 9th Rebbe. So then the Moshe Rabbeinu of the generation announces, it's enough sitting here in Kabbolas, near this mountain. We have finished all our Avodah, Bo Urshuas Aretz. It's time to go and inherit the land. It's now time for us to move forward, to go into Eretz Yisrael. Now, when we look at this, our Bar Mishana for the Rebbe, that is the Rebbe talking about himself. It's already been 40 years. And the Moshe Rabbeinu of the generation is saying, it's enough. Kabbolas is enough. It's time for us to go into Eretz Yisrael. And when we see the Rebbe talking about that, there were many expressions that were like that. So what we can see is that in these years of Nun Aleph and Nun Beis, when the Rebbe started in that summer of Nun Aleph, describing this theme of living in the times of Mashiach, right? Living with it. So if that was like details about how we live with the Geula, that we have to find ourselves and recognize the Rebbe's stress, how in our lives right now, we can see the Geula materializing as it is. And that became a very central focus. And if that was the case about the days of Mashiach, then early in Tafshin Nun Beis, the Rebbe started talking about Mashiach himself, not just as an era, as a time, but as a person. So what we can see then is that what actually happened, the Rebbe was talking about the fact that what did the Rebbe say? That the Frierdiker Rebbe, the leader of the generation, is Hashliach Hayachi Shebidorenu. He is the only messenger of our generation, and therefore the only Mashiach of the generation. So then the Rebbe continues and said that he is the Nasi of Taras HaChasidus. That's how we know. And if he's the Nasi of Taras HaChasidus, the Rebbe continues, and then the continuation to the person who took his place after this. And in that case, the Rebbe was talking about Mashiach himself. He was talking about himself. So what we see is that the Rebbe went from talking about the general idea of bringing the days of Mashiach to the personality of Mashiach himself, and saying that this is the generation, it's the Frierdiker Rebbe, and now the person who took over the leadership after the Frierdiker Rebbe, which is himself. Therefore, the Rebbe says that now that we are at this point, that we already have Mashiach in our generation, and we have Mashiach here, and he's already what is left. So it's not just about bringing Mashiach or living with Mashiach, it's about Kabbolas Pnei Mashiach Tzidkenu B'Pa'al Mamish. Now, what is this Kabbolas Pnei Mashiach Tzidkenu? This is the idea of receiving Mashiach. In other words, it's the idea of recognizing that this person, not just a time, an era, but this person is Mashiach, rallying around him, accepting him as Mashiach, and connecting to him. And that's what the point was. And that's what the Rebbe was saying. That is our specific shlichus now. That is what we need to do, to just accept, recognize, and accept Mashiach. So what we can see then is that the difference in these expressions. When we talk about lahavi limais HaMashiach, to bring us to the days of Mashiach, or lichyos im hazman dimais Mashiach, living with the times of Mashiach, then we have this Kabbolas Pnei Mashiach Tzidkenu. So these were the first three things in Tafshin Nun Aleph Nun Beis. What's the difference between these three? So in the first two, what we see is when the Rebbe was talking about to bring us to the days of Mashiach, or to live in the times of the days of Mashiach. So there, the emphasis is on a time period, right? For us to bring to this time that's in the future to bring us, means it's not here yet. We have to come to that time of Yemais Mashiach. To live with the time of Yemais Mashiach is again saying we have to act as if we are living in that time in present tense, but it's still talking about the time period and saying we want to live and understand in order to bring this period of time, or to live as if we are already in that period of time. But the third theme, this Kabbolas Pnei Mashiach, is not about the actual time anymore. It's about Mashiach as a person, as a very specific person who is already here and found in present tense, and we just have to accept him. And this was what the Rebbe said, that the idea, as we've discussed before, to bring Mashiach and to live with Mashiach, it is something that we've seen in previous generations or throughout our history, that we believe in the coming of Mashiach and that we try to live in a Geulitic way in terms of learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. But the new thing that the Rebbe said as a chiddush, what was new, the Rebbe said about this last years and these last times, is this fact that is accepting Mashiach. And this, Rebbe says, is new because this is not something that could be done in previous generations. This could only be done when we have the revelation of this person, this Mashiach in our generation. And because that wasn't until this time, the Rebbe says, therefore, this is the new element that's different in our generation to previous generations. So may we do what the Rebbe wanted us to do and accept Mashiach, have that Kabbolas Pnei Mashiach, so that he will reveal himself now.